meeting which we have of the Legislative Oversight Committee for improvement and assessment of our program here in education. I want to just reinforce what we're doing today. In the calendar, it's noted that this is a meeting specifically for the Improvement and Assessment Oversight Committee, which we have, which is comprised of folks from the Senate and the House. We also have been directed by both leadership on the minority side and the majority side of the House to have a committee in each policy committee, a subcommittee, which reviews proposed rules and makes recommendations to our GELCAR committee. And so those folks, and we kind of duplicate ourselves on this committee that we're on both. So we will be doing both tasks at the same time here. And so we do have an agenda for today. I have one copy right here, but I also have several other copies. It's a very simple agenda in terms of the first portion. We have three or four components here. The first component is what are the duties Legislative Oversight Committee and the responsibilities of this committee. And the second part is dealing with the proposed ED 306 administrative rules for education. And we have a letter which I wrote to the commissioner, and the commissioner has willingly and happily come forward to the committee to present where we are on those rules as of this point in the process. And that's part of the presentation he will be doing. Following that, there will be a portion of our time used for question and answers between the commissioner and members on this committee right here on this panel. So with that, I'd like to go ahead. It is 10 o'clock. I remind everybody this is being streamed. And so we have the mics here. If somebody can't hear us, please let us know. And I'd like to go ahead and looking at the first portion where the duties of the Legislative Oversight Committee. In the previous year, we added on to the Legislative Oversight Committee a responsibility to review and make recommendations relating to the academic standards under consideration by the State Board of Education pursuant to RSA 193E2A. That's the academic standards. The minimum standards for public school approval are a total responsibility. They're approved by the State Board of Education. This committee has responsibilities to look at academic standards, and as we look at it, we also look at part of our statutes on 193E, where there is our 13 criteria for the substantive criteria for an adequate education, which are dealing with the academic standards and therefore a responsibility of this panel right here. And when we're looking at this, there's certain sections within the rules that are being proposed. There's a front side and the back side. I'm sure the commissioner will speak to that. The back side deals with those subject areas. The front side deals with all those other areas within what does the school have to achieve to be an approved public school. So it goes from facilities to staffing to number of credits you need to graduate from high school, minimum, and then it also gets into those subject areas with elements within. So without going any further on that, I'd like to jump down now. I wrote a letter to the commissioner, and in that letter requested that we have some communication as where we are in that process. We recognize there's been an extensive hearing process, and we've had an initial proposal. We have a final draft proposal, and maybe we can be updated as far as where we are on that whole process, and then have the presentation start with the commissioner. So I'd like to welcome Commissioner Edebalou. Welcome to our committee here, Frank, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to come in. I brought all kinds of cheat notes here, depending on what kinds of questions you all have. Hopefully I can respond to those. I wanted to start my conversation. I'm just going to offer some comments, and then I know there's probably some questions and queries.
Yeah.
But I want to start my comments with RSA 193E1 Roman numeral 2, which I think sets kind of a philosophy for this rulemaking process. And I want to be clear when I share this information with you that I represent the Department of Education, a state agency, These rules are the responsibility and are owned by the State Board of Education. I don't have a vote on that committee, so I'm happy to update you in terms of where we are, but I just think is that clear. But in 193E1, Roman numeral 2, I'm going to start about halfway through just to not overly read to you. In this section, the state establishes minimum standards for public school approval and academic standards for inclusion in the delivery of educational services at the local level. School districts then have responsibility and flexibility in implementing diverse educational approaches to instruction and curriculum tailored to meet the students' needs. And so as we have approached this rule proposal, we have tried to keep in mind the mandate from the legislature that school districts have responsibility and flexibility in implementing a diverse array of educational approaches to instruction and curriculum tailored to meet students' needs. And we want to make sure that this rule proposal does not interrupt their ability to meet their legislative obligation under 193E. So just to kind of talk to you about the process as you described, we're kind of in the middle of this. It's been a 3-year problem. And as you point out, Rick, we have bifurcated this rule proposal into what we refer to as a front half and a back half. The front half dealing primarily with how schools operate, right? How you functionally run the school, and then the back half dealing much more closely associated with content. I'm happy to speak to both parts of that, but the front half is the part that is before this committee, and that is the furthest along in that rulemaking process. It is sort of couple of interesting facts for this committee that they may not know. There was an attempt in 2014 by my predecessor to update the 306s, in particular the back half, that was not successful. It's interesting, I have a copy of the minimum standards that I actually printed out before I even took this job to familiarize myself with what was going on in there. I'm on my second spine of duct tape. That's how much worn out they are. But even in this proposal, they talk about here are rules that apply until July 1st, 2015, and then here's the rules that will apply from July 1st, 15 onward, anticipating that they would have been approved. Sadly, that effort was unsuccessful. I want to share another piece of...
Those rules at that time were readopted to the old...
Correct, they just kept the old rules, right? So nothing changed, exactly.
Yeah, I remember that thoroughly.
Oh, do you? Okay.
Yeah.
I was not part of it, but I just thought that was interesting. Yeah. I also want to read a couple of headlines that I think might be telling for you. So this is a headline, Furor in New Hampshire on Vote to Cut Standards. And reading from this particular article, it says, the change would free cities and towns to set their own standards for maximum class size. Advocates say the change would give local districts more flexibility, arguing this could lead to improved schools and to tailoring school services to meet community needs, similar to the, what it says in the statute. What is interesting about these two articles, they are from the New York Times from 1992. And I read this and I was like, oh my goodness, we're still having the same conversations from 1992 and now. So you can see that this is an effort that has been ongoing, and the conversations have been taking place for decades here in the state of New Hampshire. And I think I share that because, that's important. Everybody who is working on this rule proposal has the same goal. We want our students to have the best opportunities to succeed in life. And that is what we are after. And so we are, all the conversation that takes place around this, I think we need to stay focused on the fact that we're all sitting here and working to try and benefit the students and the children of New Hampshire. The process started out with a working group with the National Center for Competency-Based Learning. That working group included superintendents, principals, school boards, teachers, digital equity project leaders, business leaders, and other educators. And they got together initially and were working on kind of an initial draft that they were working on. They held a number of listening sessions across the state, as well as a group, and a lot of virtual sessions. They held working sessions. There was a working session in the fall with 45 educators. And then after that, Christine Downing held listening sessions with over 200 educators around the state. Whereas a typical rule proposal has a single public hearing. This particular rule proposal had 3 public hearings to make sure that we created many opportunities for people to weigh in on this rule. We also created an extended public input period that lasted through the end of April. Again, to afford everyone an opportunity to weigh in on this. And in spite of all of this, I will say that there continues to be a variety of inaccurate information relative to the rule proposal, but I'm happy to respond to questions about that. Because this is a process that's in the middle, like this process is still ongoing. The board is still working on this rule proposal. So I have a document in front of me here, and I'm happy to share this with you, but again, understand that it's a fluid document, and it includes a side-by-side, and the side-by-side, it includes, the initial, what do we call it, the current rule, so basically what's currently in the 306s, and then what we have is the initial proposal, which was adopted, I believe, in February. And then subsequent to that initial adoption, we had meetings with, ongoing meetings, because it wasn't like this was the first time. We had ongoing meetings with the NEA and with the NHSAA, some business leaders, to further work on that initial proposal, and we reached agreement on a number of additional changes. And then we received feedback from GELCAR, and so we've responded and are working on responses to the GELCAR comments as well. So just trying to be really transparent and keep track of these. This is the document that the board was working on in their last working session. The board scheduled a separate working session apart from their normal meeting schedule for the sole purpose of working on this, so that anybody who was interested could come in here. The deliberations of the board in terms of wrestling through and looking at the different aspects in the different areas. I want to flag a couple of, changes to this document that I think are...
Excuse me, just for 1 second,
Yeah.
Commissioner. We have copies of the current 306s here.
Great.
The initial and the proposed, but we don't have a copy of that side by side. Is that available so that the committee can have that at the close of the meeting today?
Yes, we will email that over to you so that you'll
Thank
have
you.
a copy
Thank
of that.
you.
And so there is not, just to be clear, so there's not a final proposal yet. The board is still working on this. In that working session, I think we got through about page 67 or something, right? Like obviously it's a very substantive rule. And they intend to take it up at this next meeting and continue to work through the rule proposal. So there will likely be additional changes that they adopt. But I want to flag a couple of areas for you. So one of the substantive changes that took place here was that we've added a number of definitions, working with the NEA and HSAA to make sure that we're providing clarity throughout this document and everybody's on the same page. It's interesting. There was one term in the proposal. We had created a definition, but then we never used the word. And people were like, well, why'd you take that out? I'm like, well, because we didn't actually use it anyplace. So we're trying to figure out if there's a place where that needs to be used. But, because the intent here is not to create a dictionary as much as it is to clarify terms that will be used in this rule proposal. Another place that there was some confusion and misunderstanding is, in my draft is on page 32, but it really is in section 306. That's 0.11. 306.12. And here, a couple of years ago, the legislature homogenized the education statutes with other statutes of OPLC to refer to educators as licensed educators. And so that resulted in us changing the term certified to licensed. And there were individuals who saw the term certified struck out and misunderstood that had been changed to licensed to just make it consistent with the law. So we heard a lot of feedback from people like, why did you eliminate certified educators? And we certainly haven't in this proposal. We just used the term licensed, which is what is consistent with statute. So wanted to flag that one for you if that's one that's interesting to you. As well, there was in that section 306.15, which is in the proposal 306.12. But so we talked about educators, including art, music, health, physical education teachers in accordance with the class size requirements. And so basically those were already included in the class size. So nobody's eliminating the requirements for art and music and health education teachers. They are already called out in the section on 306.17 where that resides. And so this was a redundancy, and it was just clarifying the language in here. And then I want to talk because
Are you willing to, rather than jump over to talk about 306.17?
yeah, that's where I was going to go next. Actually, is the class size?
Yeah.
Yes, that was the next item. And again, I'll answer anything that we want. Okay, so it's interesting. So I didn't know this until maybe like last week when I found those articles from 1992 that this conversation about class size is one that's been going on for decades. And really, let me try to summarize kind of the perspective of, the department and not necessarily the board. And so I make sure that that is clear, although this is the proposal from the board. The proposed rule said the local school board shall establish student-centered ratios that promote student learning as appropriate for each learning opportunity and learning level. I mean, there was a great deal of concern that we're eliminating class sizes. And so philosophically, I would tell you that the board is not fixed on something here. We're really trying to have a substantive conversation around this specifically, because if you are designing instruction, the first question that you would ask yourself would not be, how many kids do I put in a classroom? The first question you'd ask yourself is like, what is the content that I'm teaching? You might then ask yourself, what is the pedagogical approach that I'm going to be using? The next question you might ask yourself is, what are the characteristics of these individual learners? And then you might get to, how many of them should I cohort together in order to create an effective instructional environment? And I don't think that there's really any debate that there's more that goes into making this determination than just coming up with a number. And so the board was really trying to come up with some language that would capture the process that we want schools to go through in order to be able to figure out what is the right number of students to cohort in a class. Because if you have, 24, if let's say 24 is the number, you put 24 struggling second grade readers into class, that's too many, right? Like that cohort size is wrong. But if you had asked all those precursor questions, you might end up at a different place. And so we're trying to just make sure that that happens. We did ask a number of organizations for proposed language. Nobody's actually come up with the magic bullet on that one in terms of what it is. Language that is being discussed right now is the local school board shall establish student educator ratios that promote student learning for each learning opportunity and learning level based upon school safety policies, content, instructional method, and characteristics of learners. And then the local school board shall adopt model class sizes that shall be used solely for purposes of estimating school district budgets. And again, this is proposed language. Certainly the board is open to whatever that might look like. It's interesting, since 1992, when we had this debate previously, maybe we had it before that, I don't know, we have not seen an increase in the educational attainment of the students, right? So we've held the line, but we've not seen an increase in outcomes and from our students. And so the question is there something that we can do here that helps? Now, understandably, on the flip side of this, there is a fear among many communities, and we've heard this loud and clear in the public comment, that what this will do is cause irresponsible school boards to pack 50 students into a classroom and, resulting in a degradation of the quality of the education that those students are receiving. In fact, that's not what anybody's intention is trying to do, right? Like we're all trying to make sure that we're creating better opportunities for students. And so the question is, is there a way to structure this? I mean, maybe we just got to go back to the 1992, just put a number in there. But I might even argue, and I've heard argumented in the public comment, that by just limiting those class sizes, we're also not preparing students for the future, particularly in a post-secondary. So you have a student who's never been in a classroom that's greater than 24 or 30 kids, or many of these students, are in classes of 12 students. And all of a sudden they find themselves in some post-secondary institution at Ohio State or at UNH with 300 students in a seminar class, right? And so, but I can tell you that this is not a hard conversation for the board. They feel very comfortable that if we just have to go back then to where we were, that's okay. But they want to try and make sure that we challenge ourselves, that we challenge the state to have an opportunity.
Yeah, I got one.
I just have a couple of more points I was going to flag for you, and then I'll take questions.
You're still in this section?
Yep.
Okay, why don't you go continue with the section you're on, which is 306.17.
Okay.
And if there's anything, because there are several questions from us.
Okay, do you want to, let me go, you want me to get through all my highlights for you, or you want to stop at each one? I can stop here if you want.
Let's stop right here.
Okay.
And while we're on it and had a little bit of a discussion already.
Great.
306.17, it talks about learning levels versus grade levels. It also has that current pupil-teacher ratio is K through 2, 25-1. And then grades 3 through 12, 30-1.
Yes.
And with the recommendation to be less than 25. The concern that we had when we were costing out the education formula budget, and I'm sliding into the dollars and cents.
You are.
Yeah, and we had suggested that it be K through 3 at 20-1, and then grades 4 on upwards at that 25-1. I believe that's what we had within our recommendation. It didn't fly anywhere. But is the state board taking a real significant look at this? We realize that 30-1 in an elementary classroom is pretty tough. And if you're going to relate the dollars, the ability to pay these people, they're connected. So the question is, is the state board really taking a good look because we are seriously looking at ourselves.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that the state board is pretty serious about this, even with the proposal. They're saying, like, look, we have to ask the right question. 30 first graders or second graders is too many kids in a classroom. Even 25 might be too much. If you have struggling readers, then 10 might be too many, right? Like, so what we're trying to say is there a way to ask more and to write this rule in a way that provides, as the statute says, responsibility and flexibility to that local school district and come to good outcomes and not create a circumstance where an irresponsible school board does something stupid for these kids, right? I mean, I don't know that that's going to happen. Nobody knows that's going to happen, but so we're trying. So I think we agree on all these kind of constraining factors, and they 100% are looking at this.
I guess my last, and then I'll let others. High school can make the necessary changes. They can load up a PE class or some other classroom, but an elementary classroom is a classroom, and
more difficult. Yeah.
Everything's taught in those four walls, mostly. And so, I think there's got to be a lot of flexibility for K through 8. That's my 2 cents worth. Are there questions here, Representative Cornell?
I think it's fine to say that leaving it up to individual school districts will take the responsible way of doing it. But when you come across a school district that's struggling with money, with finances, or even struggling to find teachers, they're going to double up on the size of their classes because they have no other choice to do it unless it's in statute that they can't. And if we don't tell them that you can only have so many kids in a class, if they're struggling and they can save money by doing it, they're going to do it. So I think it needs to be in there, the exact class size. And if they want to make it smaller, they can. But I don't think we should let them make it bigger than what it could be.
Yes, and we've heard that feedback, and the board has heard that feedback loud and clear. But you can understand that what we're really trying to say is, how do we have this conversation about setting the right class size is what we're trying to get to. Maybe we can't get there. And so I appreciate all of that. What you've said is all relevant feedback. I mean, the only thing that doesn't help me is that poor secondary student who goes off to university and finds himself in a 300-person seminar that's never really experienced anything. So maybe if there were opportunities in our secondary environment to get kids some kinds of exposures like that too, because we want our kids to be successful in that post-secondary world as well.
What, follow up?
Follow up.
We all did that, though. I mean, I was in classes of 20, 25 in high school, and I went to UNH where sometimes I would have 500, 600, and I'd be watching it on a screen.
Yeah, and so what we know is, so when those students go to those post-secondary environments,
They can do it.
well, some do it, but actually what you'll find is that that's one of the biggest areas where they don't succeed, right? Because of the degree of transition. I'm glad that you did it. I did it. I'm sure many of you did it. but there are students who are not successful in making that transition. So is there something we can do to help them transition, right?
Do we have a study that shows us how many have failed?
No, I just have
No.
anecdotal information and
Okay.
feedback from my, post-secondary universities.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
The last part, I need a rationale why we're changing it from grade to learning level. We're going to have different learning levels at every grade. So there be the part of the issue, and we're trying to drive towards a competency-based education. So how's that come into this mix?
Yeah, so I think it's just yet more conversation about trying to move towards a competency-based system. And I think that this is a conversation that came out of that original study committee when they were looking at this and trying to say, like, really, when we say grades, which is, it's vernacular that we're all so familiar with, right? Because it's been around for a very long time. But the reality is we want to focus on students and students' learning pathways, and students are going to be at different levels. And so the question is, by using different vernacular, does that help us look at a student differently, as opposed to assuming because the student is in fourth grade, this is what they need to be learning, even if they haven't mastered the third grade learning yet, right? So we've moved this kid along, but we can say, like, okay, so in math, Billy's on the fifth learning level. In reading, language arts, maybe he's at the third learning level. So we're really trying to create a system that is responsive to those students. Again, not a conversation, not a change that I think the board is fixated on, as much as just saying, like, how do we continue to move forward our competency-based learning system that recognizes that, students, we don't want to dictate to students what they should be learning plus or minus 180 days to the day they were born on, which they had no say in. Essentially is what we're after here.
Thank you. Why don't we move on here?
Okay.
Any further questions on that portion? I know there are, but they'll probably
I have a question with the certified teacher as opposed to a licensed
Yeah.
person. Is there an RSA that says it's okay to use a licensed rather than certified teacher in public schools?
There is. In fact, it changed it. You changed the language in the law to talk not about certified educators anymore, but about licensed educators. So we just were trying to make the law, to make the rule reflect what you did to the law several years ago. So you've changed the law to reference the requirements for licensed educators. And so now the rule will reflect the statute as well. I can have someone send over that statute to you if that'd be helpful.
So in follow-up to that, sort of, Frank, within statute, it says grades.
Yep.
It doesn't say learning level.
Yeah.
So some may construe that by rule, we're changing statute, which is counter,
Yeah, which would be flag against that argument. No question about it. And so I don't think the board is fixated on that so much as wanted to make sure we have this conversation about, are we designing a system that's responsive to what the kid needs to learn, not based on what day they were born on.
Okay.
So and again, this is an opportunity for feedback. I'm going to bring all this feedback back to the state board and, just reflect for them that they're not interested in learning levels. They're interested in class sizes.
My comment has nothing to do whether I like or dislike something. It has to do with,
Consistency, yeah.
no, it has to deal with legislative responsibility and executive responsibility. The executive takes law and moves forward with the law. It doesn't write law. And that's what we're sort of seeing, and maybe in some cases where you change the definition of competency when competencies clearly established currently in law.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm driving here. And we also oftentimes say grade levels, course program, what have you. And now we're seeing a change coming from the board rather than through the legislative process.
So I guess how I would respond to that is, this is a fairly substantive, like I've got like an 80-page rule proposal that we've tried to hear from a whole bunch of constituencies. And I think, to your point, we see as an agency, our responsibility is to have 100% fidelity to the law. So for example, again, that competency-based definition was developed with all kinds of input from all kinds of stakeholders. When we got the feedback from from GELCAR on like, hey, competency is already defined in legislature, I think that the board is just going to adopt the legislative definition because we don't have authority to come up with our own definition if you've already defined a term.
Thank you.
Yep. So let me, just a couple of other things I'll hit. So let's see. The next thing, this was something that was pointed out, and we haven't resolved this completely yet. But in section 306, hang on, it's a long one, 306.21, which is around high school curriculum and credits and stuff like that. And then if you go to E, we have a list of, courses that are that the schools are required to offer. And so this is another one that Jelcar pointed out to us, and we think we have to resolve this. But in particular, we've got something called Family and Consumer Science that's enumerated there, that the school is required to offer that. That is not in my list that is allowable under 193E2, right? In other words, so as I understand the statute, right, if I look at that statute, I'm allowed to make rules relative to the stuff that you guys have given me, but I don't get to go make up and require a school to offer a course that you've not, as a legislative body, already required. And so, again, Family and Consumer Science has been in there for decades, right, as a requirement. But as Jelcar pointed out, they're like, hey, Family and Consumer Science is not in the list. So what is your statutory authority to create rules around that? And we said, good question. It's always been in there. So one that we'll take back. But I don't know if the you all want to weigh in on that. Or,
Yeah,
we're trying to figure out what we want to
you
do.
give us an opportunity to do so. I'd like then to just jump, when you talk about family consumer science, we have as one of the 13 criteria, personal finance literacy. And that was just added in the statute, a year or two ago, as part of adequacy. And I don't see any reference to that. And how are we going to deal with that? In the past, for example, when we had like the fourth year mathematics embedded that course into the fourth year, we took statutory language and put that into rule.
Yeah.
And how are we going to? I was talking to several people at graduation, kids, and they're saying, I still don't know how to write a check.
Oops.
That's a real whoops. And that's what we heard from the Bankers Association too when we went after personal finance literacy. So how do we integrate that into this? Does it come underneath what we just discussed?
Yep. So if you see in the proposal, we've added number 18, personal finance and financial literacy as a category. And we have had conversation to say like, well, do we have statutory authority for family and consumer science? Because that incorporates, to your point, going right to personal financial literacy. There's a little bit of personal finance in there. There is some economics that's associated with that. There might be some social studies. So does it fit into those categories? But otherwise, we are trying to determine if we have statutory authority to even have that category.
Do you have statutory authority to fit it into economics? That's under social studies, those 5 components.
I believe that we would,
this is
yeah.
separate.
If we can make the case that family and consumer science is, economics or something like that, but I don't think the board has concluded on this yet. But that's what we're trying. That's the conversation we're having. Can we fit it into these other categories in 193E2? Or not. And if we can't, we don't know that we have statutory authority to go forward. If we do, then our response to Jelcar would be one that says, well, our statutory authority for family and consumer science is that we believe that this includes the components of social studies and personal finance, and we just have enumerated them as a separate line item in this rule proposal. But that's the kind of thing that we're just working through as we put the rule together. So. Another section that we have updated, let me get this, it's going to be on page 63, is relative to, so in the initial proposal, in the rule, it initially had it said there were 43 courses that everybody's supposed to offer, and then it enumerated in each course specifically how many classes in each course, right? Let me just grab that real quick. Yeah, so in other words, like in arts education, you have to have 3 courses. In business education, you have to have 3 courses, which, by the way, you might have to try and figure out where the business education fits in here as well. But family and consumer science, you're required to offer 3 courses, as we've talked about. And so when we did the initial proposal, we were not able to identify, where this 43 came from, what was magical about 43, like why not 45 or why not 40 or why not 60? Like what is the number and why 3 art classes as opposed to 4 art classes, and why 3 family consumer science and not 2 of those and more of this? And so initially we just said that they were required to offer learning opportunities. In working with the NEA and NHSAA, there was a concern that 43 was just a bridge too far. Like if we pulled that out, even though nobody can really identify where it comes from, that was just too substantive a change. So we basically said, okay, so you have to offer 43, but across these areas. So they're going to still offer at least 43 classes, but they're going to offer them across these various domains. But again, in offering school districts flexibility and responsibility, should we be dictating how many family and consumer courses you should have, as opposed to saying, you got to offer at least 43 classes, and they got to be across these domains. You got to offer something in each of these domains, but we're not going to tell you how to distribute those courses across those domains. And so that's really kind of where we are right now with that. So that's an area that we've been working on.
So you touched on the arts, and within statute, we don't call it just the arts program. It's the arts program including music and the visual arts.
Correct.
So why are we not using that definition within the 306s rather than just calling it the arts?
Good feedback. We can absolutely do that. Yeah. Art, we can absolutely do that. And that way, and that in and of itself, I like that, Rick, because that would incorporate these other elements into it so that those other elements that you're requiring in statute won't be left out. I think that's a great recommendation.
And we might check some of the other areas like health.
Exactly.
It's health and wellness.
Yeah, we should just, our language should just mirror that
What we have in
language.
the criteria, those 13 areas is what we need to reflect.
English, language, arts, and reading. Yeah, we'll just use the vernacular, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a very helpful meeting.
Keep marching.
Okay. 68. So here's a section that has received very little public feedback, which is so we had initially established something called graduation expectations, which is a little bit like a portrait of a graduate. This is in section 306.22. And the only feedback that we got really relative to those was that they want them to not be graduation expectations, but graduation requirements. And so that's kind of the public comment. I was surprised that we were kind of dictating those. I mean, I like all the content that is in there, but I thought it was, in so many other areas where we're trying to be careful not to overreach and require stuff. It was a requirement, and that was feedback. So I'll leave that as a passing thing. The next area that I wanted to flag for you is in the table. And this is the table. Actually, Julie, I didn't bring a copy of this. See if I can read this. It's the table 306-1. And so in the initial proposal, so this is the required credits for graduation. And in the initial proposal, we had added additional required credits and reduced the number of electives. Initially, it was 6 electives, and it reduced down to 2.5 electives. There was some concern, I think, at the board level that, we have compulsory education, so these students are required to go to high school for 4 years, but really that's almost a full year of electives. And so if these are the minimum standards of what we really want to make sure these kids get when they get out of high school, is that too many electives? But then again, in working with the NEA and with the NHSAA, that was modified, and so now there's 4 electives. But some of the additions that you'll see in here included like a logic and rhetoric course, a civics course.
Where are we looking right now?
Well, I found that chart in the original,
Sorry.
let's see.
February 15th.
306.21. Sorry, 306.21. I'm sorry, I didn't make a reference for you. I just referenced the table name.
Okay.
Are you at the chart required program areas and courses, or are you at the chart which deals with the
Required courses
credit
for high school graduation.
306.21.
306.22. It might be
And
two,
what?
too. Hang on, I'll go look at the other. This is the problem when you have so many versions of these things going.
Yeah. I've got one version of this, 306.21, that's titled Alternative Programs.
No.
It's not that.
Yep. Page 37 of the initial proposal.
The initial proposal.
And it is, if you're looking at the current rule, I believe it's in 306.27. There's a table called 306-2, required subjects and credits for high school graduation.
Okay.
And I'll give everybody a minute to get there. So 306.27 in the current rule. 306.22? 306.22 in the proposed rule.
Yeah, I'm just looking at a different version, but I'm not 306.27.
So it's the table 306-2, which is required subjects and credits for high school graduation in the current rule. Do you have an extra copy of this? How many you got? Just one? No, that's okay.
So,
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
the initial proposal that the commissioners reference is the February 15th, 24.
Correct.
And you said it's on page,
37, I believe.
the printout I've got only has 33 pages
Yeah,
Okay, so it's not
to
that.
it, so.
yeah, we took the front side stuff there.
Hey, wait, Julie, will you go find it for him in his? Julie,
You
will
can
just
also find
look at your document and find it for you.
You
So
can also find it in the current standard.
it's in the current standard.
I found
can-
it under 27 in the current.
Yeah, that's where it is.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the one we're looking at then.
Yeah,
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
yeah.
And so essentially what we had initially done is we reduced the number of elective credits from 6 to 2.5. The board has subsequently looked at increasing that to 4, but has added additional course requirements, a logic and rhetoric, a civics and civility. Then, and again, some of this is in response to HB 216, which was passed by the legislature that required certain courses relative to history. So we have a history, government, Constitution of the U.S., and then what was added was a half a credit in statistics or data analysis.
So when you're adding in logic and rhetoric,
Yep.
we want kids thinking, we want them communicating. When we put that into adequacy,
Yep.
we stated that those areas of learning should be integrated into all categories.
Correct.
So it's not one of the 13, it's down below listed along with, I believe, computer and use in digital literacy. So why then are we making it a separate course rather than integrating logic, thinking skills, rhetoric, able to communicate with a little bit of logic,
Yep.
into language arts, into mathematics, into social studies, into science, biology, etc.
Yep. So I think that the purpose that what the board is thinking, and again, I don't know, I can't get into their minds completely, but I think the thinking is here that again, these are the credits that are required for graduation. So there's now a half a credit requirement for logic and rhetoric. And it doesn't say that that has to be offered as a separate course, but it does say whether it's integrated or not integrated, that you have to demonstrate logic and rhetoric. And I think the point that the board was after there is to make sure that there's an emphasis, right? Sometimes when we focus on the integration, it gets diffused and maybe is not emphasized enough. And I think that the board's intent there, and I think that they believe they had statutory authority given its call out in 193E2 to require a half a credit in that and not be disruptive to whether or not it's integrated or not integrated. Like, so they're not specifying that it's not integrated.
We certainly don't want to object to logic and rhetoric being used in our schools.
Right.
We
And
were
I think they're
trying
just
to-
try-
the
kind of-
intent was basically to integrate that, but I know when we initially had computers in schools, we had to have a separate computer class. Now it's just, spreadsheet is part of everything.
It is, yeah.
Okay. Yes, Representative Cornell?
So when you're saying the board thought, are you saying the State Board of Education is the one who's determining what these subjects are that a student needs to graduate from high school?
That's correct. It's
Okay.
the State Board of Education that sets the rules.
Okay, but what do they work? the State Board of Education is deciding what classes students need to graduate from high school.
They're deciding what credits they need.
Okay, thank you.
And so they're enumerating the credits that are required for graduation, which is that's the system that we've always had. And then they're trying to do that in fidelity to the statutes that you all have passed.
So by putting these in, the equivalent required for graduation was 20 credits.
Correct. It's still 20 credits.
You're
Have not
staying at
changed
20.
that.
Okay.
Just have taken the 6 electives down to 4 electives and added, a half a credit in mathematics specific to, statistics, at least a half a credit in statistics and data analysis. I think, again, the board's perception is that that's a very germane thing for kids to know, to be able to look at data and statistics and understand that. They've added, half credit in logic and rhetoric. And then I believe they've got a half a credit in, it's called civics and civility. So
By doing this, rather than integrating, are we cutting back on the arts? Are we cutting back on those subjects which a student would benefit later in life?
I think this is some of the feedback that we got when we went from 2.5 elective credits to 4 elective credits. Some of the feedback that we got from the NEA, from the NHSAA, from some educators were like 2 things. One is, that to your point, there may be students who are more focused in some of these areas and they want an opportunity to get more exposures to that. So we moved that back to 4. The other is in many of the high schools, they have what they refer to as kind of programs of study. So you may have students who, pursue kind of a, like a particular pathway, like a STEM pathway or an arts pathway or a humanities pathway. And by creating these elective opportunities, it allows students to go deeper in those particular pathways and have some more flexibility to do that. Whereas if we overly prescribe exactly where those credits are going to be, then it makes it more difficult for a student to focus on STEAM or for STEM or focus only on the humanities or something like that. So I think when we moved it back up to 4, that was in response to that kind of feedback that we received.
Higher education is doing the same thing with NECHI and taking that degree and maybe knocking it down to 90 required.
So I've been highly involved in a degree in 3 program, again, because students can go into post-secondary and get their required classes in 3 years and not have, a full year potentially, and depending on the program of, general education requirements.
With more work-based and internships.
Different opportunities. Okay. Just a couple of more things that I wanted to flag for you. So some of the public feedback we got was relative to the ED 306 rules around facilities. And this is simply because those rules were they were an exact duplicate between ED 320 and ED 306. So the ED 320 rules are the school facility rules. And so it didn't make sense to have them in 2 places, the same exact rule. So now in the 306, we just reference, the school facilities pursuant to the 320 rules so that we're not repeating those rules. And then the other area was relative to assessment. So we used to have assessments that were covered in here, but the assessment rules in the 306 previously covered both the requirements for the state as well as the requirements for the local school district relative to assessment. And so initially we pulled that out and we had a draft of just assessment rules that would be required for the school districts, but it included both the state's requirements, because we have certain requirements as an agency that we have to comply with, as well as the local school districts. And so from the public feedback that we got, essentially I think what the board's going to do is take the school district assessment requirements, put those back into the 306s. So we'll have an separate assessment rule that will address the agency's rules relative to assessment, and then we'll put the school district's rules relative to assessment into the 306s. And so those are some of the changes that I was hoping to flag for you, but I'm sure that there probably are other questions as well that I'm happy to try and respond to.
Thank you. Now we're getting into the Q&A. Are there questions from the committee?
And can I, by the way, just point out that this meeting has already been immensely productive, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'll start it out going to the front page definitions.
Yeah.
And the reason why is that a lot of these definitions impact the back half.
Correct.
We talked about competencies. or we talk about performance or achievement. Under the definition of acknowledgement of achievement means when a student has demonstrated achievement. You know, so we're defining achievement as achievement, but that doesn't cut it. You know,
So
it doesn't
Can you
really.
tell me which definition you're, oh, not acknowledging achievement, that's the old definition.
Well, no, I'm looking at which rules am I looking at here? What do you have for a definition?
So,
of-
so
of
the
acknowledgement?
current rule says acknowledgement of achievement means when a student has demonstrated achievement of district competencies or graduation competencies. That was changed to achievement of competencies means a student has demonstrated competencies at a proficient level. So we tried to eliminate that kind of circular reasoning in the current rule.
Would it be proficiency of competencies?
So we talk about proficient as a term that's defined. So and maybe it should be proficiency of competencies. We can take that back and take a look at that.
To take a look at it.
Okay. Let me go to proficiency. You're taking notes there, right? Yeah.
And is your definition of competencies the same as in statute?
Correct. And now I do know that the board is intending to just update the
Change that.
competency definition to mirror statute, which is as it should be.
Okay, the definition of work-study practices next.
Okay. So this, let me just get to that. So what's interesting on the work study practices, this was a comment that we got back from Gelcar. So we just, again, there we tried to just stick with statute because you've defined work study practices in 193 E2A 6D through F.
Yeah.
And we just referenced those. It was interesting. And we'll have a conversation with Gelcar if they want us to do that. We referenced the statute. Gelcar said, well, can you write these out? And we're like, we just put the statute in there. Why would we write them out? But so we'll figure out if they want us to write them out or if we can just make a reference to the statutory definition. But we've used the definition in statute right now. So they're in 193 E2-A, Roman numeral 6D through F.
The definition for work-study practices is in 193H, Roman 7, Roman 8.
193H, tell me that again.
Roman 8, H1. Definitions. Now, what's your definition in your proposed, can you read just in what you have there in the side by
This might be a
side?
good feedback too. That might be another good catch too. So we were using the definition. This is why we needed to redo these statutes. Is we were using 193 E2A 6, and we were referencing D through F. So D says applied learning means an educational approach whereby students have the opportunity to directly engage in learning activities using knowledge and skills. Logic means a reasoning skill that better enables students to analyze problems in learning areas such as mathematics and to develop problem solutions, to better understand the principle of cause and effect, and to develop critical thinking skills to better identify fact from unverified information or data. And rhetoric means the skill of speaking and writing as a means of communicating or persuasion. So that's what you had in statute, and we use those.
I understand, that's throwback to 193.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we were using.
I am concerned about the area underneath performance accountability for the work-study practices.
So you're 194 H3.
Yes, H1.
Oh.
H1, 193.
H1.
193 H:1,
Yep.
Roman 8.
Yep. Targeted support and improvement.
It says work-study practices in my book.
Okay, 8. Got it. Work study practices means those behaviors enhance the learning achievement. I think that I think we could probably put that as the definition. I think that's a good.
You've got
feedback.
that in there, but you chopped off on page 581, the next page over, from and work-study skills that contribute to success in college, career, and life that include communication, creativity, collaboration, and self-direction.
No, I think that this should be the definition, Rick. I think that's a
So
good
we
catch.
need to
That's
just-
good feedback. Yeah.
Put it all in there.
Yep. I don't think any of us saw that one, huh? Yeah, exactly.
Yes, Representative Luno.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Which of these proposed rules would you, would you say relate to academic standards?
So that is going to be the back half generally, other than the section that we reviewed previously, which listed all of those academic areas. So.
Right, right. And when you talk about, and follow up, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
When you talk about this process as being, and I think I'm using your word, infidelity with the laws.
Yeah.
What does that mean when it comes to making changes to rules that relate to academic standards, like the ones you just talked about?
So I think that we're trying to align those content areas that we referenced there to 193E2A. So.
Okay, and would that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah,
but I'll do my best. Yeah.
No, but that's sort of what I was trying to draw out was
Okay.
was what you just talked about, because I think 193E2A is the operative area when it comes to these minimum standards, and in particular E2A, and I think it's Roman 4C. Talks about how the state board, and this actually goes back to, I think, a point you made right at the top when you said the state board owns these rules. But it says right here in Roman 4C, it reads, the state board shall not amend any existing academic standards and shall not approve any new academic standards without the prior review and recommendation of the Legislative Oversight Committee.
Correct.
Established in CNA, which is sort of a subset of what we've got here today.
Yeah, well, so that's part of the reason why we bifurcated this, because then the operational rules can go forward, but those rules that relate to academic standards and content standards from 193-2A would come back to the legislature. I think
Right.
that's the problem that Ginny had back in 2014, right?
Okay, so actually that's something that you didn't really talk about. You talked about how in 2014, those rules did not succeed to go through the process, but you didn't really talk about where they stopped.
Because I was not here then, so I'm not exactly sure where they got stopped. I just
Okay.
have the draft of the proposal that had two versions, like one that they proposed and one that they didn't. I didn't know why it didn't go forward.
So what happened on that is that 306 point, let's say 40, and then 306 401, those all were, we ran out of time, and there was a 2-week period there when we had no rules. And that created problems, obviously. So then we reflected back and readopted the rules that were in law at that time, or JLCAR had previously approved. That's where we ended up. So
Okay.
all the proposals went down.
So we're going to try to get something to you that you can be happy with and work on. I don't,
Well, there were a lot of areas we were happy with, but we just ran out of time, the
Yeah, okay.
rulemaking process, and we do have the attorneys here from, attorney from JLCAR now.
Mr. Chair, this is what I'm going at. It's what you're just talking about here, the rulemaking process.
Yeah.
And it would appear, based on the law, that the rulemaking process for any proposed rules that relate to academic standards has a special process that involves the Legislative Oversight Committee. And I guess one of my objectives to get out of this meeting today is really understand what that process looks like and what your anticipated timeline is for that process. So, for example, if rules that pertain to academic standards have to be reviewed and recommended by the Oversight Committee, when's that going to happen? When's the idea that's going to happen? Is that going to happen on August 14th, or is that going to happen? Is it happening right now? And how would that process go? And I would really refer to, and I'm sure you've seen this before, Commissioner, this very overly complicated flow chart, decision chart with respect to JLCAR. And I'm being facetious when I say overly complicated, because I know it's a very involved process here in New Hampshire. But for rules that relate to academic standards, it has even some additional process in there involving oversight. So timeline, process. I'm wondering when we're going to really hear about these things.
So that process, again, before I can even get something to you, I have to get a consensus among the constituents of, educators and the NEA and NHSA. There's no reason for me to bring you something that is not, that we can't reach consensus as the education system to even take a look at. So I know that the board is working on that. I don't know what their timeline is. They're actively working on it. Is it probably over the summer sometime? I would guess. And again, we're going to fit it into. We've also got the 186.8 process, again, just in conflicts with statutes, which is, the State Board of Education shall adopt academic standards, right? So I've got that statute that I have to reconcile with this same process that I have over here in 193E. They're working on it, but until I have something that is cooked enough to bring to you, but I think that I will come to you before anything is final, almost like in this process, so that you can then have substantive weigh-in on it. But I want to bring something to you that's pretty far along.
I appreciate that very much, Commissioner. 'Cause
Yeah.
we're not looking to waste anybody's time.
Yeah, and I don't want to waste your time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so what I take that for today's meeting is really an update.
Correct.
Where we are. You talked about
Well, so today is
how we're in the middle of the process right now.
But I'm going to separate the two processes because I've got the academic areas and then I've got the operational stuff. I think the operational stuff, we're okay. We're going to just work through this with the board and be able to move that process forward in JLCAR. But relative to the academic stuff, as you point out, there's an extra step in that process.
Does and just one more question, because I think I have a hard time delineating the bright line difference between form or process and mechanical rules versus the academic standards. But in your opinion, where do things like class size fit in? Is that like air quality, or is that like what teachers are doing in the classroom?
Yeah, so what teachers are doing in the classroom is probably not the right vernacular that I would use, but
Okay.
if you look in the rules, in the existing rules, I think it breaks about 0.31. You'll see there's a very clear kind of delineation. We start at 306.31 is where it starts, and we begin with arts education programs, right? So then we start in with content areas is where we begin to make that shift. And hence my question for you all relative to, these are content areas. I think that we only have authority to deal with areas that are enumerated in 193E2A. I got family and consumer science, which is not there, but I do have it in here, right? And so the question is, and we'll work on those and probably bring those to you, and you're going to have to decide, do you guys want us to bring these, family and consumer science rules? Do you want us, like when I bring you a proposal for those rules, like we'll work on them. You got to decide, hey, Frank, you guys don't have authority to take that forward because your authority on these rules is limited to 193E2A. But that's a decision that I think, it's a legislative decision. What do you guys want us to do with this? So.
Right. And
Go ahead.
just along this whole string, and thank you, Commissioner, I appreciate your indulgence in this area. But in the same section of law, 193E2A, dropping down to Roman 6B, and now we're into the definitions area that you were just talking about. You cited a definition for applied learning. B is the definition of academic standards. So in that definition and statute, academic standards means what a student should know and be able to do in a course or at each grade level.
So can you reference me where you're reading?
So I'm on page 560 on this book.
Okay. And where are you reading?
Down at the bottom.
Okay, academic
left-hand
standards, got it,
column,
okay, yep.
Academic standards, and it's the definition.
Yes, okay.
And so it means what a student should know and be able to do in a course or at each grade level.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, does that definition of academic standards, is that definition of academic standards limited to just the curriculum such as what begins on in your rules on 30631, which you say is the bright line delineation between academic standards or academic related rules and other rules, is the definition of academic standards in law really a bright line thing that really talks about courses and programs, or does what a student should know and be able to do in a course or at each grade level also relate to, for instance, your proposed class sizes by grade level or by learning level? Does it also relate to that too?
Yeah.
And I'm just putting it out there, Commissioner, because just because the current rules, front half and back half, where the back half is academic standards starting on Rule 31 for arts education program, just because the state board said it there years ago doesn't necessarily mean that academic standards doesn't relate to other things too.
So what I would tell you is I don't think that's what the words say. I think the words are pretty clear in terms of what's being said. And as well, that would contradict, the historical, how these rules have been worked on historically, really forever, in terms of the state board adopting changes to those front half and implementing those for the schools. And then really when they work on the back half, the 0.31 forward, the history has been that they come to the Legislative Oversight Committee. For the most part, I've found instances where they have not even come to the Legislative Oversight Committee for changes there. So I think that, where the board has drawn that line is the right line.
I think this discussion just reinforces some of the issues that we previously discussed. For example, in that same section of law there on page 560, when we're talking about the minimum standards of public school approval and then academic standards, when we talk about grade level, it's not learning level.
Yeah, I understand.
And that's reflected throughout this book. So
I thought that was fair input. Yeah, 100%
so
heard that.
I think that's very important. And I think what we need to be looking at in terms of these academic areas that they're in, I know this committee would like to have the opportunity to look, for example, I was looking at career technical education, and I'm seeing some definition changes there as well from what we have as definition in the book. And
if you would provide that to us, if there's a statutory definition, we will have fidelity to the statutory definition.
And we'd like to follow that up with communication with you.
Okay.
I know there's two of us on the CTE Advisory Council right here on this particular committee as well.
Great.
And it's an area which we see we need to be emphasizing more than we have in the state. And then on page 561, under the annotated version and all that, there's reference to the application personal finance literacy. And the intent was that it be not necessary, under studies earlier in law, we do say it may be integrated within other areas, but there is also an intent that we must teach that stuff. I'm up to however, the local district wants to do it. That's their decision, their choice. But in the long run, we need to have some kind of a measure or accountability that it is being taught, whether it's a separate course, a required course. I think I'd like the state board really to consider that. This is an issue that has been heard over and over and over again. Our kids don't know how to use a Visa card, a MasterCard. They don't know how to write a check. They don't know how to file taxes. And on it goes. So, points of interest there. Also as we call these things like arts education, I mentioned that.
Yeah, we should just homogenize that with the statute. I think that's a good idea.
Information and Communication Technologies program to computer sciences, what we call it now. Social studies, including the other 5, economics, civics, government, history, geography.
Yep.
And under technology, engineering, education program, we have an engineering and technology. There's some changes.
Yeah, we can homogenize those. I think that's really good input. So,
Are there any other questions from the committee here? What we can do is we can bump our heads together here, not necessarily this morning, but at a later date and trying to get some information to you. When would you need to receive that by, Commissioner?
in the next
I know you're
couple of-
going through the process right now.
Yeah, like
It's-
if you're able to get us something by the end of the month, that would be
That'd be
wonderful.
fine. Okay, we can do that.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. I've got just a couple of questions that I think that are update
Okay.
Oriented. I've heard through just conversations with other people that certain individuals who have been leading this process have changed over time. Just wondering who's sort of hands-on leading the development work on these draft rules right now.
Well, so I'm not sure what changes you're referring to because we have had continuity, so I'm not sure how to respond.
I had just heard, just from people suggesting to me that there had been changes, but who's in fact the, sort of leading the hands-on work?
Well, I mean,
today?
so these now are in the hands of the State Board of Education.
Okay, okay, and the research and development effort that was contracted out has been, that those deliverables have been met, and now this is with the state board.
No, there is still ongoing support from the National Center for Competency-Based Education.
Okay,
There is ongoing support there.
okay, thank you very much.
Is there anyone from the Department of Education that works with the board on any of this?
There are many people that do, depending upon what the particular rule is,
Like,
like me. So do you have and if you have questions, you can direct them to me, and that would be helpful.
thank you.
I know I've worked with Steve Appleby. I've worked with Jeff Beard.
It just depends on the area. There's
Yeah.
there's all kinds of areas, right? And so we're calling in the various experts, but not, some of those individuals don't have domain knowledge that cuts across many different areas. And then we have individuals who have expertise in the JLCAR and the rule writing process who are involved in it as well. And then
Frank,
Julie has joined
can
me
you
today.
answer this for me, please? When we look at the back half, and we're looking at those curriculum areas relevant to the 13 categories and criteria for an adequate education, we noticed, for example, when we had a number of bills coming to us this year dealing with mental health of students in their schools. And we saw that mental health was one of those elements listed underneath health and wellness, as those areas been struck in what in the copies I have here, there's all lines going through all those elements. Why are we striking out some of those items which have our curriculum frameworks are outdated, most of them. And so we look at that, and when we looked at that, we say, well, we are providing mental health. It's required in the 306s. I can't remember what part it was, whether it was that .36 or whichever one it might have been.
Right.
Why did we strike all that stuff?
Yeah, so I mean, there's ongoing work on the back half of the document, and part of that is because over time, that back half of the document has gotten what I would refer to as somewhat confused sometimes and convoluted. As Representative Luno pointed out, the State Board of Education, so you're setting 193E and you're saying these are the areas of study. The State Board of Education is adopting academic standards in those various areas. Whether that's Common Core for my mathematics, my English language arts, we've got social studies standards, we've got health standards. So you have these standards, and then essentially those standards then are supposed to translate into curriculums that aligns to those competencies which align to those standards, right? That's the dividing line. The state is adopting standards. The local district is responsible for developing the competencies that align to those standards and the curriculum for instructing that. What happens is these academic areas in the back of this document sometimes come in conflict with the actual academic standards that the state board has adopted. And so we had asked, and I know that educators have been working on going through that back part of the document, and kind of the agreement that we reached with that group was that they were going to go through that document and they were going to identify rules in these areas. So rule language that can be incorporated into another or new section of the ED 306 front half of the draft, specifically where that language should be incorporated and provided, right? So there's stuff in that back area, in those academic areas, that's more general instructional stuff about how you operate a school. Well, that should be in the front part, right? We don't need that in the academic area. It should be in how you operate a school. The next thing, excuse me, was proposing rule language that can be carried forward for consideration for modifying our state academic standards and content frameworks, right? Because there's stuff in those back half documents that probably belongs in the state standards, because at the end of the day, it's those state standards. We want our educators to be able to go to one place and say, like, this is, if I'm an arts educator, here's my arts standards, this is what I'm supposed to be teaching, right? Not, I got to go to my standards and then I got to go check the 306s and see if it calls out something else. I'm trying to make a simplified system that has coherence as it's applied. The next is that there might be rule language proposed for content areas not addressed by current academic standards, right? So I've got areas in the back half of that document in those academic areas that I don't have academic standards for. Like, we've not adopted state academic standards for personal finance. Now, most schools are using the national standards for that, but we've not adopted them. So we're going to need that content in the back half of that document, because it can't come in conflict with a standard that hasn't been adopted by the State Board of Education. Or it could just be that it's information that is superfluous and it's not really needed. It's not adding to clarity for our educators who are trying to instruct those standards into the schools. So that is kind of the work that we're doing there.
Yes, go ahead.
So you are incorporating the feedback that you got from that group of educators that was working together and gave a lot of feedback to you into the back half of the.
Correct. We're trying to discern it. It's not always that clear, because we have a lot of various opinions, right? So what we've seen is there was a lot of diversity of opinion among people in terms of what we wanted, but we're trying to distill it, and we'll make proposals, right? So there'll be proposed changes. We'll do side-by-sides on that as well and kind of work through that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just would like to close out the back half here, but that discussion, when we looked at health education this year, and we looked at the old curriculum frameworks, which are ancient history,
2003.
And when we looked at this, there was significant guidance that came to us from both the old frameworks and from the 306s. We were trying to discern, where are these academic standards? Now, I've asked that question not just of you, but I've asked it of Jenny, I've asked it of Lionel, going way back. And and they say, well, the academics, the curriculum frameworks are the academic standards.
That's correct.
Well, then we eliminated the curriculum frameworks. So we had legislation this year where we put curriculum frameworks back into law. It's not been signed into law yet, but we hopefully will get that back into law. So then when we see these curriculum frameworks, which are guidelines, but also host and contain these academic standards, are we going to be able to look anywhere and clearly see the academic standards for geography or for health?
So those are incorporated into those curriculum frameworks. And again, historically, going back into the early 2000s, that is how that everybody worked on this system, is that they created what you could call academic standards, but they weren't solely that. They incorporated the curriculum frameworks into it to try and make my understanding is anyways, to try and make those academic standards more useful, right, for the educators. So those curriculum frameworks were adopted by the State Board of Education as the academic standards for those content areas. They were voted on, decades, in the various decades in past.
I get that, but I'd also say that, I've, as a school administrator, principal for years and years and years, we looked at, various sources to tell us what are the standards to be taught at this level.
Right.
And we oftentimes at that time had to go to the old textbooks. We didn't have it, or what were the goals or the objectives.
Yeah.
But now where do we go? We go to these academic standards, and we're seeing a progression of topics that should be taught.
Right.
Are all those topics the academic standards, or are there some clear academic standards for civics education?
Yeah, no, so for example, those were adopted in 2005 by the State Board of Education as the academic standards. Okay. And so just going one step further, what we're trying to do in this process, to your point, is not have two places. So I got to reference my, curriculum framework academic standards, and I got to reference the 306s to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing. Can we get this stuff consolidated into a single place is the direction that, I mean, that's really the framework that you all have set up, right? Going back to the very beginning of, that the state is responsible for.
Yeah, it says it's a shared responsibility.
Is
and
a
all
shared,
that
yeah,
stuff.
but the state is responsible for public education. Okay. In the system, the state establishes minimum standards for public school approval, the front half, and academic standards for inclusion and delivery of an educational system, right? And so that's what we're trying to say, like, that's what we're going to come up with, right? And so what we don't want to do is we don't want those academic standards to be diffused in two places so that people are like, well, I looked over here, but I didn't look over here. Like, let's see if we can't get all this stuff together, I think is the right way to do that.
I hope you can manage to get this thing done so that we can.
I'm not as optimistic that I can redo all of those, because you open up these academic standards and it just goes, it's very difficult. There's a lot of constituent input that needs to take place.
Well, as a local school district, I have responsibility for curriculum and instruction.
Yep.
And when I look at my curriculum instruction, and the instruction has to parallel what we're teaching,
Yep.
and the accountability system, so that I want to be able to look in one place as the school principal saying, here it is, teachers in the building, these are the academic standards. If you can get them all hooked into those frameworks, that's wonderful, rather than us having to go to the 306s and carve through that and trying to figure it out.
Exactly.
Doesn't work.
I am wholeheartedly in agreement that I think everybody would benefit from a more straightforward, simplified type of an approach.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Representative Luno.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Commissioner. So I appreciate what you talked about in terms of the rules, the proposed rules being in draft form, that it's a working document right now, and that nothing's really firmed up in.
Well, I do know that the board is still working on it.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. So I appreciate that very much, and I'm glad to hear it too, because we've got a lot of different sort of versions floating around this table right here. So we're not quite sure where things are at today, and so your updates though have been very helpful. But Mr. Chair and Mr. Commissioner, would now be the time though where the legislature, this committee, the legislature, the Ed committee, could maybe get some firm definition as to the process, step-by-step process moving forward, and a possible timeline for these rules. And I'm just saying a possible one, like in the process, it takes 6 months to do this, or it takes 3 months to do that. But something that we could look at now while these rules are being worked on, so that we understand what all of our different roles are in the in the development, recommendation, and approval of the rules. Do we know enough to draft a process and workflow document at this point?
Well, so the process that you should follow is the GELCAR process, right? That includes statutory timelines and statutory, deadlines for moving forward. So we are going to follow that process, and depending upon, how much input we get or don't input we get, the state board is going to take up the draft and continue working on it. Like, until they agree on a final draft, I can't go to the next step anyways. And so they're working on it, but I think your best framework is the GELCAR process, which is statutory.
Thanks, but as we've talked about, for the academic related standards, the quote back half of this document, it also involves this this committee. Isn't that my understanding? Isn't that
Well,
the understanding?
what we got to do is we have to, the last time this was done in 2015, and that was the requirement we had put in law every 10 years. And so we can back off and we can calculate, working with Attorney Morrill here and others, determine what's the final date you're going to have to get this thing done by. And working with the board, finding out where the board is, I think that there's some latitude for this. And so we can get some dates and we can start planning ourselves as far as the communication. First, I'd like to see the side-by-side that you have. It's a working document. Now,
we
that's
can
not the
provide that to
final
you.
product.
Yep.
We get that. But we need to be able to offer some suggestions, and I'd like to put a list of those things together and get that off to you guys as soon as possible at the end of this month.
Yep.
So we will meet again before the end of this month. And then we will also work with the attorneys and the board, finding out, is there a projected date in which your board is going to take that?
Well, so the board is governed by the JLCAR process, right?
yeah.
So I'm trying to encourage them to
Yeah.
act in a speed that keeps them in compliance with their statutory rulemaking requirements, right? Because if they default on that process, I'm not sure if we have to go back to the beginning, I'm not sure how that works, right? So
Yeah.
I've not ever defaulted on the rulemaking process, so.
The attorney can give us some help along that. We don't.
Maybe,
need to do it
yes,
right
exactly.
now.
But he can lay out the
Mr. Moore.
JLCAR process that we are bound by, right? That's what we have to follow, so.
Yeah. We'll iron
It's
that
not
out and get that
mysterious.
communicated clearly for us, right?
Okay, I think that needs to be done. Thank you very
Are
much.
there any other questions of the commissioner right now?
Just a thought, Mr. Chair. That while we have, I think we'd sort of budgeted, a couple hours for this meeting. So we possibly have a little bit of time for this, but we do have some members for the public here. Transparency has been an important, part of this process, and I'm wondering if maybe we could open up to some public comment.
No, I'm not going to go there with that because I put it out clearly beforehand and in the letter that I communicated with the commissioner that we are not going to take other input. In fact, the hearing process has been established where the public can communicate on these, draft rules directly to the State Board of Education. And when's that process conclude?
So we had, as I pointed out, an extended public comment period that lasted from February 15th till April 30th. Is how long that the public comment period is. We still continue to receive feedback from constituents in the field, and we're happy to take that. They cannot be part of the formal public comment at this point in time, but certainly Rick gave me a number of good suggestions today that we will take back and process those. So we're interested in getting a good proposal, but we did have an extended public comment period and provided ample opportunity for everybody to testify.
Yeah, if we have desire to get, individual members on this committee can go get that information, then we can have a meeting and we could get input if we want that on the back half regarding the academic standards. However, I think for us to conduct a hearing on the minimum standards for public school approval, we're stepping out of our domain. Our responsibility is not that, it is that of the academic standards which are integrated into the back part, but there's front part too, like competencies impacts the back and the definitions impact the back. And so, but I feel this time that we are able to, in the letter I wrote, the June 11 meeting is open to the public. However, the primary purpose of the meeting is to allow for a dialogue between the committee members and the department. As public testimony and written comments regarding draft changes to the 306 rules has been received by the state board. And I do not want to get into the role of being the state board.
And I've tried to summarize for you kind of where we are in the process. All of the information, all of the public feedback is on our website. Everybody can go look at every single thing, all the correspondence, the entire process for how we've gone through this. All the various iterations are out there as well. So if people have questions, I would encourage them to take a look at them.
Are there any further comments? So with that, I'm going to close the meeting and thank you very much, Commissioner.
Thank you.
I wish you good pathway ahead here with this. It's very, very important. And it impacts every student in this state and future students. And we have to make some changes here. If we don't do something, it's just like I said the other day with higher education, we got to watch what's going to be 10 years from now. And it's not going to be good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we are still here. We had, is there any discussion amongst ourselves on this? I heard that we're probably going to have another meeting here this month.
Oh, I'm sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think you're probably right, Mr. Chair. And something I want to think a little bit more about too, and I wonder if you do, Mr. Chair, is a comment you just made, which I think was very good. That there are parts of the front half document related to the minimum standards, such as competencies, that also have bearing on the academic standards. And should things like competencies or changes to competencies, things like that relate to the academic standards, also be in the subject to the oversight committee?
I think it relates to improvement and assessment, and that's what this committee is tasked to do. I think there is a relationship between some items. Now, maybe a school facility, I've always advocated, though, that's the fourth leg of the stool. If you don't have a good building, you're not going to have, a chemistry lab. But I think that we should be looking at those definitions which impact what we're doing in the second half, like career technical education or competencies or proficiency versus achievement and learning versus grade. I think that interacts with the back half. There's some areas though that don't,
Right,
and it's
no,
not our domain.
Yeah.
So I think we'll try to filter through that and identify the areas. I'm not saying no to it.
No. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and perhaps as the commissioner is updating the side by side, that maybe for a first pass, those rules that do have bearing on academic standards, not just Rule 31 on, but those could be indicated in a side by side so that we all know what we're referencing.
So I'll make the easy reference, which I apologize for jumping back in, but it sounded like you had a question. So it's that list, right? That says, like, for example, where it says, and again, this is some of the feedback from JLCAR, where it says family and consumer science, right? Am I able to make rules on that or not? That's a question that I have. And so if this, body can kind of weigh in on that and say, do you want us to do rules on that? Or not? We're happy to, or we're happy to not, but we want to try and make sure that we're having fidelity to that statute.
Attorney Morrill, did Representative McGuire submit a list from JLCAR or of things for the DOE to look at that we could possibly get a hold of?
Yeah, we have our comments. Well, we have our whole the JLCAR comment. We could provide that to you as well. I mean, it includes all of your comments back to us.
Oh, yeah, we'd like to have the comment sheet.
Okay, we can send that to you as well.
Yeah, that'd be good. Anything further? I think we're done. Hopefully get an early lunch. I want to thank the public for commenting. We're not done. We're just going to work on this. I think there's some good things going forward, but some things which we have to look at from a legislative perspective. So thank you very much, all. Have a good afternoon.
Yep.
Yep. Pardon me? Yeah, you didn't get us out the other day at 12:05.